Beyoncé is a crooked feminist and a dumb ideologue. But she understands economics far better than those who criticize her for using alleged sweatshop laborers for her clothing range. As much as I dislike her, her music and her dopey opinions, I have to defend her on this topic, because her critics are wrong. And they're wrong by a huge margin. And while we're at it, let's defend sweatshops as well. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. The Telegraph reported on this story, but then they removed it from their website, even though I was unable to find anything inaccurate in the story. Well, maybe they realized the story in itself is a bit ridiculous. Anyway, let's read from what the Telegraph first published. Beyoncé clothing range is made by sweatshop laborers on £4.30 a day. Beyoncé's new range of women's sportswear is made using sweatshop laborers who earn as little as £4.30 a day, it has been reported. The Sun on Sunday reported the clothing range, which Beyoncé said she hopes will, quote, support and inspire women, end quote, is made by Sri Lankan seamstresses, some of whom earn £4.30 a day. Workers are paid more than the legal minimum, but campaigners describe the labor as a, quote, form of sweatshop slavery, close quote. Topshop has claimed the Ivy Park range will, quote, empower women through sport. One machinist told Tabloid, quote, when they talk about women and empowerment, this is just for the foreigners. They want the foreigners to think everything is okay, end quote. A 22-year-old seamstress told The Sun on Sunday she earned 18,500 rupees or 87.26 pounds a month, which is about half the Sri Lankan average wage for a 9 3/4 hour shift, 5 days a week, plus overtime. Beyoncé and husband Jay-Z, the rapper, are worth combined £760 million. Jakub Sobik from the charity Anti-Slavery International said, quote, this is a form of sweatshop slavery. There are a number of elements here that tick the boxes in terms of slavery: the low pay, restriction of women's movement at night, and locking them in. Companies like Topshop have a duty to find out if these things are happening, and it has long been shown that ethical inspections by these companies are failing. They should be replaced by independent inspections. The Sri Lankan manufacturer making some of the Ivy Park garments is MAS Holdings, owned by tycoon Mahesh Amalan, 61, and his two brothers, which employs 74,000 workers in 48 factories across Asia. Alright, I think I get it why the Telegraph decided to remove the story altogether. It sounds like it was written by a far-left, economically illiterate activist, if you pardon my stream of pleonasms. The marker of a story written by an economically illiterate author are all over the article. Numbers without context are one such example, or the abundance of irrelevant information such as the total worth of Beyoncé and Jay-Z, as if that matters, and weasel words such as tycoon, because employing 74,000 workers and directly contributing to lifting them out of poverty is somehow bad. But let's take it from the beginning. For starters, £4.30 a day is not a wage indicating sweatshop slavery. £4.30 is 5.56 euros or 6.30 US dollars. Now, 6.30 US dollars per day may seem awful when looking from, let's say, New York. Not so when looking from Sri Lanka. Every dollar is worth $2.90 in Sri Lanka in terms of actual things you can buy with it. That is called the purchase power parity. Now, how do I know that? Well, the nominal GDP per capita in Sri Lanka is 3,818 US dollars, but when adjusting for PPP, that becomes $11,069. That is 2.90 times more. So the actual wage is $18.27 per day. Monday to Friday, so 20 days a month, that's $365.40. And that's before calculating what she got for the overtime, which conveniently the anonymous complainant leaves out from the conversation. Anyway, that's not half of the Sri Lankan average salary. That's actually 50% more than the average Sri Lankan salary, which is $242 per month. Now, do you think that's bad? Think about it this way. The electrician in Sri Lanka who risks his life daily so the democratic socialist paradise of Sri Lanka keeps running, and who is usually a man who supports an entire family, makes no more than $300 a month. That's less than the so-called exploited women that the London liberal media is pitying. Whether you like it or not, Beyoncé is actually empowering women in Sri Lanka by paying them way more than what their work is worth on the local market. You may not like Beyoncé, and I certainly do not like her, and I hold her in utter contempt, but on this issue, she is correct. And she is putting her money where her mouth is. The biggest problem, though, is that most of the chattering class are economically illiterate. Most journalists have a socialist view of the economy as a zero-sum game, and most of them are also completely oblivious to the mechanisms of price formation, which does include the price of labor, aka the salaries. That is in addition to being utterly oblivious to the incentives that make laborers take up a contract or not. Let me put it this way. No matter how bad you may think those alleged sweatshops laborers are, the alternatives are far worse. Otherwise, laborers wouldn't be in such a rush to work for Beyoncé's clothing line. And this is true in virtually all cases that posh organizations such as the Anti-Slavery International decry. Now, do you remember the Bangladesh tragedy? Western liberals agitated strongly to impose sanctions on Bangladesh to end child labor, and they won that battle. But nobody asked what happened then. I'll tell you what happened. Most of them ended up in prostitution. Even Paul Krugman, the artisan of big government solutions to everything, had to admit that the agitation was wrong. You see, individuals don't go into sweatshops unless that is the best option available. Same goes for child labor. Families don't send their children to work in sweatshops if there are better alternatives. And in most cases, there are better alternatives, but not always. Remember the child sweatshops in China? Well, they've mostly shut down because there are better alternatives now. The government did nothing about them. Taking the sweatshop option away by government fiat or by sanctions does not eliminate the necessity of work. It just forces those allegedly exploited to take an even less desirable job. As repulsive as a child working in a sweatshop may be for your sensibilities, that's not nearly as repulsive as a child working in prostitution because his or her workplace was shut down thanks to economically illiterate Western activists. Whether knowingly or unknowingly, Beyoncé is doing something positive in this direction. Her actions prevent poor Sri Lankan women from turning to prostitution by providing them with better paid jobs. You see, prosperity does not come overnight. Sweatshops were very common in the United States as late as in 1935, or in France in 1950, or in Germany as late as 1965. Heck, even Sweden had a few of them way into the 60s. Eastern Europe had them way into the 90s. There is no magical formula to speed things up. The sweatshop is a necessary phase in a country's road towards prosperity. No prosperous country of today has become prosperous without having had sweatshops and, yes, widespread child labor in the last 50 years. Heck, some forms of hardline child labor, such as children working in tobacco fields, is still legal and widespread in the United States today. And that's perfectly fine. Rural folks in the very poor areas of the United States also need to progress. And they will, provided they will be left alone. Also, think about it this way. Countries like South Korea have managed in less than 40 years to achieve what Europe achieved in over 200 years. In 1970, South Korea looked like Britain of 1810. South Korea now may actually enjoy a better standard of living than Britain. Now, I haven't checked the latest tables, but they were both usually somewhere in the lower part of top 20 countries with best standard of living. If left to their own devices, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh will also rise further. By 2035, sweatshops will probably be a distant memory in Bangladesh because enough local wealth would have been created to no longer need them. But you have to give it time, and one has to understand that the economy really is not a zero-sum game. We get better clothes at a cheaper price, and they make small incremental steps towards prosperity. Nobody loses. But then again, why think this through when you can just join a feel-good mythology cult, such as the anti-sweatshop movement, and virtue signal all over the place how you're against exploitation? And, do that on Facebook, which has its own sweatshops of people who review reports, and do it via your iPhone, almost exclusively manufactured via sweatshop labor. Isn't it great? Ultimately, boycotts and sanctions send a completely backwards message. Basically, you're telling Sri Lankans that they cannot trade with you because they're not rich enough, and they'll be allowed to trade with you when they become rich enough. But how can they become rich enough if they don't export anything, if they don't trade anything to begin with? Anyway, with all of that being said, thank you for watching and for your continuous support. I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.